Welcome to the ARL Now podcast. I'm host Dan Egito, and today we're talking to Dean Naujoks, the Potomac Riverkeeper. Before we get started, let's first tell you about our sponsor for this episode. Here at ARL Now, we worked out of industrious co-working spaces for years, and honestly, it's been a great experience. Everything's taken care of, the coffee's brewed, the supplies are stocked, and you can just focus on your work. If you're looking for a productive workspace, Industrious has metro accessible locations right here in Arlington. Check them out at industriousoffice.com. Dean, thanks for coming on the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know we connected just a couple weeks ago about the sewage spill that everyone's been talking about in the Potomac River. Can you tell us a little bit about what has been happening?
Okay. Yeah. It seems like 2 years ago, but January 19th, Martin Luther King Day, I was recovering from oral surgery. And then there was this massive catastrophic sewage spill. But unbeknownst to me and many other people, it was largely being reported that it was DC Water was working to contain it in the C&O Canal. I was relieved to hear that on Tuesday when I heard about it. And then I started getting reports from people late that afternoon that this was all going in the river. And to my horror, when I went out on Wednesday, sure enough, 40 million gallons a day of raw sewage from a pipe that, carries about 60 million gallons a day of raw sewage was just dumping into the river unabated. And I'm already like just doing the math in my head, like, wow, this is already 120 million gallons. And then I went back out Friday with sampling, and now it's like upwards of 200 million gallons. And, just through a quick Google search, I realized that this was probably one of the largest sewage spills in U.S. history and still not contained. Not one drop had gone to the C&O Canal. So we started getting a lot of media to come out and report on what was actually happening. I think a lot of media felt like they had been misled by DC Water. I certainly did. And I know a lot of elected officials felt the same way, So that's kind of what started it. By day 6, it was starting to be contained. But meanwhile, keep in mind, this massive storm was coming in. And so that's why we felt like getting some attention on this was really important. And then started this whole series of our sampling data. We started partnering with University of Maryland, and we were showing that it was not only dangerously high levels of E. coli at the site, but also downriver as well. We sampled all the way down 8 locations down in National Harbor, and we were partnering with University of Maryland. University of Maryland was finding Staph aureus and MRSA at the site. And while they did not detect any MRSA downriver, they did detect Staph aureus at some of the sites, some of which all the way down to Georgetown. So we were pushing for a public health notification and advisory for recreational users. And I know people are like, hey, but it was the dead of winter and there's ice all over. But, we were getting calls from DC firefighters who were practicing drills and putting people in the water. Swift boat rescue in Montgomery County, right down at Lock 6, right downstream from the site. Lots of people there was 2 polar bear plunges that were still planned, and they were not canceling them from going in the water because there was no public health advisories issued. And I just thought this was insane. If this had been in the summer, it would have been totally different. They would have literally closed the river, told everybody to stay away from it. There would have been lots of testing, and nobody was doing any testing. Our testing and University of Maryland's what prompted DC Water to really start testing and publishing data. It was just amazing. The first testing, it's been now a month, just happened last week with Maryland Department of Environment, as well as Virginia DEQ, below the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. It's the first time they actually got out and did some testing. And meanwhile, we're out there kind of on the front lines doing all the testing and then being rebutted by DC Water, who kept claiming that the water was safe, that it was meeting standards, that they had full containment of the spill, only to find out that there was multiple releases that occurred. And including Super Bowl Sunday, when another 600,000 gallons plus was released back into the Potomac River. And then they had to report that they had reported their data inaccurately. And then finally, 25 days too late, DC actually then issued a public health advisory. So honestly, just the beginning was just trying to get something that should have been so simple. Public health advisory put up, considering it was 243 million gallons of sewage. We believe it's likely more than that. And it just should not have taken that long. EPA was sitting on its hands, did not do any sampling, made no public responses. We tried to meet with EPA. They wouldn't meet with us, and they just kept deferring to DC Water. DC Water is the entity that actually caused this massive sewage breach. So I've been doing this for 25 years. The idea of having the polluter actually control the narrative on public health, and speak for public health agencies and regulatory agencies that are supposed to be providing oversight was literally unprecedented. I dealt with the Dan River coal ash spill in 2014. EPA's response was drastically different, and I can talk about that. But all I'm saying is everything that we dealt with was just kind of unusual and extraordinary considering the size and magnitude of one of the largest, if not the largest, sewage spill in U.S. history. So now we've shifted focus, obviously, with Trump, getting involved in this whole back and forth between him and Governor Moore. But the bottom line is we needed EPA to get involved, and they should be doing more. Actually, as far as I'm concerned, we still have not gotten a meeting with them or DCDOEE now a month out, which is pretty unbelievable, quite frankly. And just it's just been frustrating. So there's community meetings that are coming up this week. We'll be attending those. We're meeting with MDE, and so things are starting to, move forward in terms of response and accountability. But I can talk about some of the next steps if you want, but that's kind of like a quick update just over the last month of just how crazy it's been.
Yeah, that sounds like you've really had your hands full over the last month. Even trying to keep track of all these updates, let alone, trying to do something about it.
Yeah. And not to mention, we were out there just, the media, I swear to God, I did well over 50 interviews.
Mm.
So it just was just a lot to do the interviews because we needed the attention at the same time, just dealing with the issue because, the sampling and then the response and trying to get meetings and coordinating like letters from like Senator Van Hollen was asking us, what should we be saying in this letter? So we had to help draft. And so our whole team, our whole organization, Potomac Riverkeeper Network, has literally been drinking from a fire hose and just literally all hands on deck, working all hours of the night. I have speaking engagements every single night this week
Hmm.
and, meetings. So working 14, 16-hour days. It's been a lot. It's been a real lot for this organization. So thank you for everybody who is a member or has supported our organization. We greatly appreciate all that support because we definitely need it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and thanks for what you're doing about spreading the word with this. I know, your team has been really proactive about getting that information out there. I was wondering because I know we first got in touch when you about some of the test results that you had from the Potomac. I know you actually went up there and were doing the tests yourself. Can you describe what it looked like and smelled like up there when you were first getting involved with this?
Well, when 40 million gallons a day raw sewage is just gushing right, underneath the C&O canal and then flushing right into the river, it's a sad thing to see, to be honest with you. But, you're seeing all this toilet paper and rubber gloves and condoms and stuff, but you can still see that if you go up to the canal. I was just up there yesterday. So, and then we could talk about the diversion into the canal if you want. But so, our response, since there was no data, was to test upstream as a baseline at Old Anglers. And then we tested the direct sewage discharge, which quite frankly, you're putting yourself in danger when you are grabbing those samples because there's
Mm.
MRSA, there's staph, other bacteria, there's parasites, all sorts of nasty stuff, pathogens. Anything you find in sewage was in that. And so we're grabbing samples and then we're grabbing samples at the site at Lock 10, a public access point, one of my favorite stretches of the river that I float every year from Mather Gorge down to Lock 10. I've swam right where all that sewage is coming out, which is just
Mm.
really sad to think about. And then, we sampled downriver too. And again, we had to literally bust holes through the ice after the first week, with a hammer because it was so cold. And, but, we did what we had to do to kind of show, where we're seeing, and just kind of have a steady line of sampling data that went all the way down to National Harbor. We picked National Harbor because there was a polar bear plunge planned, and they were asking us, so we just figured we'd cover all the bases in between. We had 8 or 9. I think we have 10 sampling sites now that we've been doing every week. At first, obviously, the levels of E. coli were just screaming high, like 12,000 times higher than EPA says what's safe for recreational use. But as you move downriver, E. coli levels started to improve after the first, week or two. I do think it's worth mentioning that the experts have has raised concerns about things like Staph aureus and other bacteria being trapped in the ice and then
Mm,
being released at a later date when it meets warmer waters. And I just think it's really important for the people to understand that bacteria doesn't thrive in 39-degree water. So um, there's still a lot of concerns that we have moving forward with this bill. But as far as the data goes, things have been improving downriver from the site, but we are still seeing really high levels of E. coli coming from the creek that flows past the spill site and underneath the C&O Canal and into the Potomac River. And so, we're still seeing really hot levels of E. coli at the spill site. And, basically, our data and some of the sampling, and I think obviously the media attention and pressure from watermen downriver. There's Maryland Department of Environment finally did some testing last week, uh, as did Virginia DEQ. I don't know about DEQ's data, but I think the Maryland Department of Environment, Maryland MDE data will be released this week. And I think you're going to start seeing these public health advisories lifted, certainly downriver, probably in the next week or so. We're hearing March 2nd, but we're having a meeting with MDE this week to discuss that. And likely DC too, at least in DC waters. Now, up at the spill site, which is actually Montgomery County, Maryland, we're still seeing very high levels of E. coli. So I do hope that Montgomery County continues to issue those public health advisories just to let people know it's not safe at that point, at that part of the river. But E. coli levels are drastically improving as you move downriver from the site.
mm. What's currently being done up at the site to contain it? I know there was that spill on Super Bowl Sunday not too long ago. Can you
Mhm.
describe like what the setup looks like over there right now?
Well, I mean, crews, hats off to the DC workers that are just on the ground doing all this work through freezing cold temperatures and stuff. But crews have been working since the beginning. And really what they did is, you know, there's 60 million gallons of raw sewage flowing through this pipe, right? This is not combined sewer overflow type stuff. This is straight raw sewage. And that's what went in the river, 243 million gallons of raw sewage. So, all that sewage, people aren't going to start flushing their toilets, and it comes from Dulles Airport, Loudoun County. As where it crosses the river, there was a break in the pipe, and boulders fell into that breach, and that still hasn't been, in my opinion, properly investigated. And this is something I think EPA should have been doing from the get-go instead of letting the polluter, DC Water, investigate themselves. And so the bottom line is what they did is to work on removing these boulders, and some of these are like apparently like 3-4 foot size boulders where they got to put a sling around them, send people into this 72-inch pipe, and then pull them out and remove them by hand, basically. Um, so what they did, I guess, as of day 6 or so, where they successfully started diverting sewage into the C&O Canal at Lock 14, Lock 13, and parts
Mm,
of Lock 12. And what that did is it served as a bypass for all the sewage then to flow around the broken interceptor pipe. And
hmm.
then when it gets down to Lock 11, it's diverted back into the interceptor pipe where it then travels down to Blue Plains, one of the largest advanced sewage plants in the entire world, which usually receives about 380 million gallons a day. This pipe, 60 million gallons a day is a significant portion of that overall flow to one of the largest sewage plants in the world.
I mean, that's an enormous amount of sewage that we're talking about. That's such a I'm trying to wrap my mind around that image of, like, basically, like, a river of sewage that's just flowing from point A to point B as they're trying to divert this right now.
Literally, you could put a kayak in and float it, and it's fast moving too. But it goes
Wow.
over the lock, so it's like waterfalls, and it's making a lot of noise
Huh.
and churning. Meanwhile, there's pumps, just belching sewage in. There's like 10 of
Really?
them, 10 pipes that are just pumping all the sewage in. And sometimes, like yesterday where we had a lot of rain and snow and melt. It's called inflow and infiltration, water that gets into the sanitary sewer system, the collection system, and then it creates more volume of sewage water and it kind of overwhelms the system. So there's just times where so yesterday was very high flow, obviously during times where, like 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., where everybody's getting up and going to the bathroom and flushing their toilets and taking showers. That's a very high flow time too, but there's a lot of additional water that's now getting into the
Mm.
system. But if you go to my Facebook page, Potomac Riverkeeper, I just posted some videos yesterday, or you can go to Potomac Riverkeeper Network. We have a lot of videos and things just to show people what's happening out there.
Wow, wow. And as it's flowing through these canals now, I mean, is that obviously that's better than it going directly into the river, but is that actually
Right.
safe? I mean, isn't it like leaching? Is it leaching at all into the ground or?
We have concerns about that. We know that there is some leaking that's occurring. DC Water will tell you that's not true, but our data is showing consistently high levels of E. coli into that receiving stream. It's probably hard for people to visualize, but if you've been on the Clare Barton freeway right under the 495 American Legion Bridge, basically it parallels the C&O Canal, and there's this old stream bed that runs in between. And when all that sewage broke, that was the path of least resistance. It dumped into this old dry stream bed and started flushing. And 200 years ago when they built the canal, that was a running stream. So they actually built an aqueduct, like,
Hmm.
for the boats to float over that stream, and that stream could flow under the aqueduct. And then it goes like another 50 yards down in the river. That's where all of that sewage dumped, right? 40 million gallons a day was just flowing in the river. But since they've contained it, they've had sporadic releases, right? And I mentioned the Super Bowl Sunday
Right.
600,000 gallon release. But there's still a lot of sewage on the ground and toilet paper. And I think this melting snow and stuff is washing some of that off. But again, what we're seeing right as it goes underneath the canal, and keep in mind and it goes under lock 11, and that's where it's diverted back into the interceptor pipe right above the lock 10. But lock 11 is literally filled with like 4 or 5 feet of solid raw sewage. So you have the liquid water that's flowing across the top, and as you go farther up where all the pumps are pumping it in, there's solids and raw sewage on the banks and stuff like that, but a lot of that's moving very quickly. But as it slows down in lock 11 before it's diverted back in the interceptor pipe, there's just all these solids, literally like 4 or 5 feet deep of raw sewage, just solid.
Oh.
And that's sitting on top, and that's directly over that stream bed.
Hmm.
And, we're concerned that there is leaching and leaking. I mean, this is a 200-year-old canal, hasn't been used for 100 years. It's not like it has a liner system and, that sort of thing. It was built 200 years ago. So, yeah, we have concerns, and we
Yeah.
have concerns about, if we get a lot of rain, for example, during a time like Super Bowl Sunday where people are using, their bathroom facilities and stuff, and people are having parties, like that's what caused like this 600,000 gallon release. Like, is it going to overwhelm the system now that it's completely filling up with all these solids? I mean, so basically, DC Water is still another 3-4 weeks away from completing the break to the interceptor pipe. And
Hmm.
so, that's why we're out there constantly monitoring, going out to the site, 2-3 times a week at least, and keeping an eye on things and monitoring what's happening and doing sampling and investigating. You just can't trust, and I've been doing this 25 years. You just can't trust what a polluter or somebody who's caused this type of damage, what they're saying to the public, has to be ground truth at all times. And this is where EPA has absolutely failed. That they literally have not responded, not been involved, not been engaged, deferred to DC Water over and over again. It's been really sad to watch because, like I said, I dealt with the Dan River coal ash spill in 2014 when I was the Akin Riverkeeper in North Carolina. And we were one of the first responders on the scenes, but EPA was there immediately. They were actually out talking to media, letting them know that they were in charge. that they were providing oversight. They were going to investigate how the spill happened. And they actually launched a criminal probe into Duke Energy. They asked us for our sampling data to verify what it was we were finding. They were sharing some of their data. It was just a totally different response as
Hmm.
to where EPA has been nowhere to be seen. And that's kind of, I think, the tragedy of what the Environmental Protection Agency has become under this administration.
I know you mentioned, I mean, just a huge amount of pollutants getting into the river, which, I mean, I struggle to wrap my head around just like how much sewage we're talking about. When we last spoke, I know it sounded like you were still trying to figure out what this really means for the health of the river. You mentioned there's just not a lot of historical precedent for a sewage breach of this scale. What what do you know at this point? What are you expecting?
I mean, it's a lot of it's like a wait and see type of thing, right? I mean, like I mentioned, I think these public health advisories are going to be lifted, and and that's a good thing if it's based on data, and it will be. But again, 243 million gallons of sewage just doesn't go away, and
Hmm.
because the E. coli levels say it's safe, and you go on Facebook pages and others, like some people are like saying like, oh, it's all going to be fine, and the river can handle it. It's only a small percentage of the flow. But again, as the water warms up, um, I am very concerned about fish kills and blue-green algae blooms. Blue-green algae blooms are particularly dangerous to public health and our pets and things like that. It's not something you'd ever want to swim in. And so, like, we don't know where and when this is going to show up, right? And so, we're very concerned, like in the short term, about like how a spill like this has impacted like watermen, right? We pull 3 million tons of blue cats out of the Potomac River every year.
Wow.
And it's good because they're invasive species. And that season starts literally March next week. Are those people going to be able to bring those fish to market? I don't think, I think there's going to be a lot of concerns about eating those fish. And our communities downriver, like Colonial Beach, right, where 10,000 people come in the summer and people spend money at restaurants, are they going to start figuring out in July and August that people aren't showing up to the Potomac River and not spending money there? So, I want to just make sure that these things are being considered. I mean, we know that Mayor Bowser asked President Trump for this, declaration, an emergency declaration, and she's just thinking about funds for the sewage plant, and that's great. We want to fix the obviously the collection system and the broken interceptor pipe and anything else that would potentially minimize pollution to the Potomac River. But there's just these larger impacts that I think people just don't understand enough that they're not thinking about. And just because those E. coli levels go away, and I'll give you a really good example. Baltimore Harbor does a splash event every year. They just started 3 years ago, and their splash event last year was postponed because they had these they call them tides, right? But basically they were blue green. They were algae blooms, not blue green, but algae blooms, right? That happen in the they're called pistachio tides, and because it turns the water like greenish color, and it happened 2 or 3 times. And when University of Maryland investigated like why this was happening, they basically determined it wasn't because of a recent sewage spill, but because of legacy sewage that was on the bottom of the river of the harbor, and that under the right conditions it churned up and became active, like months, years down the road.
Mhm.
And so it was blamed on legacy sewage that contributed to those pistachio tides in Baltimore Harbor. But that is something we could very well see here. Usually blooms, if they happen in the river, and they haven't happened the last couple of years, they usually don't happen until late August, sometimes early September, when the water's as hot as it can possibly get and it's as low as it can possibly get. And when this sewage spill happened, we're still in a drought, by the way, an extreme drought. And so while the water levels are picking up in the river right now because of all the melting and snow and everything, the bottom line is when this spill happened, we were some of the lowest the river had been in like 30 years. And
Hmm.
so that is not good conditions for releasing 243 million gallons of sewage into the river, which is really slow, very low, and less dilution and more opportunities for problems in the summer down the on the road. I'm glad water levels are picking up. I think the best thing that could happen is lots and lots of rain, flushing, but it still doesn't mean like all this, like this is the equivalent of 75,000 pounds of nitrates, like the equivalent of a sewage, an allocation for an entire year for a sewage plant, just boom, dumped in the river all at once. And so whether that pops up in the Potomac or middle Potomac, like down near Colonial Beach, or whether it happens out in the Chesapeake Bay, I'm very concerned about low dissolved oxygen, fish kills, and algae blooms as we move forward to the warmer months of the year.
Mhm. You mentioned, some calls that you were getting from people, even in the middle of winter, who are using the Potomac. They're not just driving over it, they're not just passing by it on a walk or a hike or something. I mean, they're actively out there in the water. I wonder if you could tell our listeners more about how do people use the Potomac?
In the
You
dead of
know
winter.
yeah, well, in the dead of winter, but also in general, what does this mean for people's ability to use this body of water and enjoy it and pull fish out of it and do whatever
Yeah.
else it is?
I mean, the Potomac River, it's the lifeblood of our region. People take it for granted, but, it supplies more than 5 million people with drinking water. There's literally hundreds of thousands of people that recreate on the river every year, with starting all the way up above Harper's Ferry, all the way down lower Potomac, DC. There's people that row crew. There's sailing schools. Um, Obviously, there's a lot of kayaking that happens on the river. We have world-class whitewater paddlers that use the river up near Great Falls and below it. And we've had several Olympians that come out of this area because of the excellent whitewater paddling that's available to them. And then there's a whole boating community, and there's weekly swims at National Harbor. There's people that have liveaboards, right? And then we have this whole revitalization of the DC waterfront, which, by the way, provides a quarter of the tax base to DC now. The waterfront revitalization, which has also happened over in Alexandria, right? So there's never been more people using the river. We started our Swimmable Potomac campaign back in 2019. We do weekly sampling throughout the summer from May through October, and post it to an app called Swim Guide to let people know when it's safe to use the river, where it's safe to use the
Mhm.
river. But, the Potomac River really was a success story. And to me, this is one of the saddest things is when I hear people telling me that they're not comfortable letting their kid row crew this year, or they're not going to
Yeah.
let their kid go to sailing school, or that people are not going to be using the river this year. And so there's a lot of people that are ignoring that, and they're going to just like claim victory once the E. coli levels go up. And that's a good thing. But this issue's not over. And the perception, that's my biggest concern now at this point, is obviously the impact from the pollution, but the perception of people not wanting to use and recreate and enjoy this river. Our mission is
Mhm.
to eliminate pollution and protect the public's use and enjoyment of the Potomac River. And I don't think there's going to be anywhere near as much enjoyment this year. And then there's fishing. You mentioned that people who do subsistence fishing, there's big bass tournaments that happen. It's amazing how many people use this river for so many different reasons. And I get to see it all because I'm out there on my patrol boat and getting on the river on a regular basis. But it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I know, it sounds like dealing with the fallout from this spill has sort of taken over a lot of what you've been doing on the day-to-day these last couple weeks, but what does your role as the Potomac Riverkeeper normally look like?
Well, it changes, every day. I mean, bottom line is, I mentioned my mission is to eliminate pollution. And so that's really a big part of what we do is we investigate sources of pollution. We do our own investigations. We use drones, sampling. We have volunteer pilots, that sort of thing. Um, we actually leverage about $2 million a year in free legal service for the river. And so we do our own enforcement actions, basically where the state agencies are not enforcing compliance with the Clean Water Act, and it's an ongoing source of pollution. We will bring a polluter to court. We're actually suing La Plata right now. The Attorney General of Maryland has kind of joined us. And well, they filed a case, then we ended up joining their case, but it was our case that we originally filed. It's called Notice of Intent to Sue. We put the polluter as well as the state and federal agencies on notice that if this problem is not fixed in 60 days, we are going to go to federal court. We're going to fix it on our own. And that has made a huge difference for cleaning up the river. We've been doing that for over 25 years now, one polluter at a time. We win 95% of our cases. We sued Alexandria recently, well, reached the settlement agreement, but we ended up filing a case against them to fix coal tar and naphthalene discharges that were leaching into the river. And put $300,000 of freshwater mussels, 40,000 freshwater mussels into the river. So that's a big part of what I do. We passed legislation making Dominion clean up 28 million tons of coal ash. We've passed legislation fixing Alexandria's combined sewer system. We do a lot of work in Maryland. Our big focus now is PFAS, these forever chemicals. We actually were at a huge public hearing in Arlington recently
Hmm.
for the Arlington wastewater treatment plant. We drove a lot of people out to that to start putting limits into those permit conditions and monitoring for PFAS, these forever chemicals that are in every sewage treatment plant everywhere in the country. And it's getting into the biosolids, the sludge that's produced, which is being put on farmlands. And farmers don't know that they're actually contaminating their own fields and farmlands. And then it's getting into our food system. It's getting the cattle that are eating it. It's getting into the crops that are absorbing it. And so this is a major source of these forever chemicals that's really getting in the entire food. And then it's running off and getting into our waterways, into our seafood. And that's why we have a lot of interest from watermen and the seafood industry on that issue. And so, we just work across the board with a lot of like non-traditional partners and allies who just really care about clean water and the work that we're doing to enforce compliance. And then, we do have some really cool programs. Like I mentioned, our water quality monitoring program, we have 100 volunteers that are trained. We have 30 sampling sites. We'll be doing trainings this April if people are interested in that. We have some very close to Arlington that we've partnered with. A lot of volunteers come out of Arlington, and then we have like our 50 million mussel project, which is in its infancy, but we're putting all these freshwater mussels back in the river because they're major filters and they clean about 10 to 20 gallons of water per day. And, like I said, that's a major program moving forward that we're working on securing funding. But our research vessel and our science barge and our 50 million mussel program is all staged over at National Harbor and our office in Georgetown. So really, we work on legislation. We're in the courts a lot, work with a lot of lawyers, and just really working to clean up and make this river the river it should be and can be. Lyndon Johnson called it a national disgrace in 1965, but said it should be a model for recreation, and it's become that. And that's the sad part about the sewage spill is it really is a black eye to the river, and it's going to take a lot to rebound. And so we're working on ways to how do we bring people back to the river so they feel comfortable coming back to the river,
Yeah.
and that's ongoing monitoring and testing that Maryland Department of Environment likely is not planning to do. DC Water is not planning to support and fund, but God damn it, we're going to make them do it. One way or another, we're going to make this happen like we do all the other things because people do care about this river.
Hmm. You mentioned an initiative, I think you said back in 2019, to try and really just improve the cleanliness of the Potomac River. I think I recall looking at like a scorecard for the health of the river over the years, and that it did improve for a couple years. But if I'm recalling correctly, it sounded like it plateaued, or it had plateaued, and over the last couple years. Can you tell us more about sort of the overall trajectory of the health of the Potomac in recent years?
That's a great question. So the scorecard is done by Potomac Conservancy. So I can't really speak to, you know, their data, but it's hovered around a B minus, off and
Mhm.
on, last couple of years. You know, the river, has come a long way when it comes to some of the more egregious like sewage pollution and stuff. We used to have algae blooms all the time on the river. The river used to be like a mucky green and there was a lot of sewage in the river. One of the things I'm really proud of is that we will be the Alexandria combined sewer system. We passed legislation in 2017. That's going to be fixed by 2030, and they discharge about 150 million gallons a year of combined sewage and stormwater of the river. And then DCs will be fixed by 2030, and they used to discharge about 2.5 billion gallons of sewage, combined sewage and stormwater to the river every year. So
Wow.
those two things, I mean, Alexandria's alone is a $615 million clean water investment. DC is spending well over $1 billion on theirs because it's a much larger system. But that'll be done by 2030. So this river will be cleaner by 2030 than it is today. And I'm just really proud of that work. It's years in the making. Um, but with that said, and the river has made a tremendous comeback from Lyndon Johnson's statement back in 1965, thanks to the passage of the Clean Water Act. And then a group like ours for the past 25 years, it's going around making sure that entities like La Plata, who was in violation for the past 5 years of their permit, 60 violations, Maryland Department of Environment wasn't doing anything. We filed a case against them. We've done that over and over and over again and fixed one pollution problem at a time. And the river's made a lot of comeback. I will say though, being a river keeper is about constant vigilance. And so when I look at things like microplastics and things like these forever chemicals and PFAS, we've made a lot of improvements in eliminating bacteria levels and raw sewage and things like that to the river. But these are new emerging issues that are concern me greatly. And that's why we, once again, as an organization, we're out in front leading on the issue of PFAS, trying to challenge all these permits. We challenged Fort Belvoir's permit. We're now an active permit challenge. We're going after trying to stop biosolid application permits down in the lower Potomac where they're putting all this sludge that's contaminated with PFAS chemicals on farm fields. We're working on legislation right now for that in Virginia. So I hope people are following us on that because we actually got some major pieces of legislation through the legislature this year, thanks to partnerships with watermen, and the seafood industry is really concerned about this issue. And then things like microplastics, there's groups working on a bottle bill in Virginia, one in Maryland, in DC. I hope people support the bottle bills that are being introduced. We still need things like, improvements in our recycling programs. Our landfills are filling up with a lot of plastic bottles and stuff. So there's a lot of efforts in other states to improve recycling programs and things like that, and some legislative fixes on that. So that's kind of like long term, more stuff
Mhm.
down the road. But I know I bounced around a lot, but hopefully
Yeah.
that gives you some understanding of the complexity when you're talking about how's the river doing
Sure.
and, you know, where's it at right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Does this most recent spill create any new concerns for you about, do you think a spill like this could happen again? What can we do to make sure that something like this never happens again?
Well, I do think this spill has brought a lot of attention. I mean, DC is considered a pretty progressive, you know, um, city. They have, you know, green roofs and things like that. Solar, they're promoting solar initiatives and stuff, which is all great. But if that can happen here, there's been a slow and steady gutting and decline of money that goes into the state revolving loans fund, which is money for sewage infrastructure for communities all over the country. And the federal government used to fund that over and over and over to help, particularly, lower income municipalities and poor communities make investments in their sewage infrastructure to protect public health and protect our public waterways and our drinking water supplies. And that's been a great thing, but it's just slowly been gutted and eviscerated and cut down. And now we see this loss, what happened here with the EPA is kind of a microcosm of the fact that we just don't have a functioning environmental protection agency anymore. And so people have come to expect that those things are in place, that their toilets and sewage infrastructure is going to work, right? That you have a functioning public utility sector that's managing all this waste load that's going to our plant, making sure our plant's in compliance, and that the collection systems are in place. But that collection system is over 60 years old.
Mm.
And if it wasn't for this disaster and the federal aid that's now coming in as a result of it, I don't think DC had the money to fix that. I mean, they were allocated money to fix that particular section of the Potomac interceptor, why that still needs to be investigated. But, in terms of all the needs of what DC water alone needs, which is upwards, according to a 2022 congressional report, it's about, upwards of $2 billion just for DC waters sewage collection system. So if you could imagine around the country, um, there's plenty of needs that are going unfunded, and slowly but surely, if there isn't a group like mine that's suing and passing legislation and forcing accountability and making sure that those investments are going into sewage infrastructure, I can tell you politicians are going to divert those things to other things, and we all need great programs for our cities and our communities. We all need historic markers and things like that, like, cities that we dealt with, like, Alexandria, right? We're putting a lot of money into, but not investing it into their combined sewer system at the time. I think that's one of the most important things we do is say, hey, you know what? You are going to make this a top priority of
Mm,
your city, and you are going to make those investments, and you are going to fix these problems. And if you don't fix them, we're going to see you in court. And that's, I think, if there's rivers out there that don't have river keepers, it's not good for the river, because clean water, everybody needs clean water. Poll after poll shows Americans overwhelmingly support clean water, investments in clean water. But I can tell you a lot of politicians are diverting funding away from clean water infrastructure into other pet projects and other things that they see as a more important priority.
mhm, mhm. Well, Dean, thank you so much for coming on the show and for not only talking about this most recent disaster, but sharing a little bit of perspective on what it is that you guys do, and what you do as the Potomac Riverkeeper.
Sure,
We're definitely going to keep tabs on this story. I'm hoping to, continue seeing hopefully improvements in the health of our river over time, but I guess we'll see.
sure. And if I could make a plug, there are two really important community meetings that are coming up Wednesday and Thursday. If you go to our Facebook page, it's being hosted by DC Water, but we definitely want people to turn out for that. And then we'll be doing some outreach events ourselves, one of which is going to be in Arlington. So please stay tuned for that, or Alexandria, right on the border. But we'd love to get people involved in our work. So take a look at Potomac Riverkeeper Network Facebook page or Potomac Riverkeeper Facebook page. Stay tuned, stay involved. We'd love to get you involved. So thank you for your support.
All right. That's all for this episode of the ARL Now podcast. Thank you to Dean for joining us today, and thank you to our community for listening. Be sure to rate and review the podcast and send us any feedback at news@arlnow.com. I'm Dan, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.